Right. Thank you, Maria. I am calling to order the Thursday, January 12th meeting of the Finance Committee. This meeting is being audio and video recorded, and I will be doing roll call as we have some people on in a hybrid format. So let's start with approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Thank you. And by roll call, it's going to be Chris.
Aye.
Peter.
Aye.
Denise, aye. Stephen.
Aye.
Joanna.
Aye.
Thank you. I am now going to open it for public comment.
Is there a different view where we can see them instead of seeing us? Because I don't need to see us. Just see them.
No, everybody, the camera catches whoever's talking. Or
But
moving.
it doesn't show that, okay.
Sadly, you just get the four of us,
Okay.
Chris, until they
In
say
stereo.
something.
Put some music on in the background. Keep talking, keep talking.
Is there anyone online that for public comment? Maria, anybody's hand raised?
No.
Okay, then I'll close public comment. We don't have minutes yet, so I'm skipping agenda item 5. And I'm going right to the discussion of citizen warrant article number 4, affordable and year-round housing stabilization fund. And Arthur, I believe you are up.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your putting me on for tonight, because I had conflict on Monday night with the planning board meeting being at exactly the same time. And as it turns out, the planning board now has a meeting at exactly this same time. I've been able to get them to hold the articles that I have on before them until we get finished with mine. So I'm very glad to be up first. As you know, this is an article to establish a stabilization fund, which would be funded with 2/3 of the revenue received by the town from the occupancy tax, hotel, motel, short-term rental occupancy tax. As you know, I submitted a similar article 2 years ago. This article is the same as that, except that I have proposed the first year that it would take place to be fiscal year 2025 because of concerns that had been expressed at the time of my previous proposal that it was starting too soon in terms of the towns having already made plans and projections based upon the fiscal year that was at that time about to start. But otherwise, the language of the article is exactly the same. That article, if you recall, got approximately a little over 60% favorable vote at the town meeting, but this does require a 2/3 vote, so therefore it did not pass, and it had been amended on the floor to be 1/3 rather than 2/3 of the town's receipts from the occupancy tax. We're back to proposing it as the 2/3, as my original proposal of 2 years ago set forth. I think there's no question that the greatest problem and issue that Nantucket has today that hasn't been fully addressed has been the need for affordable and year-round housing in a range that is perhaps above the affordable standard as set forth in the law, but within the 150 to 200% of annual income. I think we all know that there is a significant need in those ranges for additional housing to be provided and funded. And I think that the town needs to make a comprehensive effort to increase the production of affordable housing, diversifying the housing portfolio, and coming up particularly with new and innovative solutions to address the town's demand for housing, which I do not see as abating at all. It's increasing. There are many ideas as to how this can be handled. I think we all hope that there's going to be at some time passage by the legislature of either Nantucket's special legislation that's been in there forever for the 0.5% transfer tax to be applied to affordable housing, or the local option proposal that's been before the legislature. That has been difficult over the years and has not as yet passed. I think we all hope that at some point the state will wake up to the need and will allow it to be passed. Meanwhile, I think we need to encourage the state in that regard by showing that we're using every possible option, every possible alternative, every possible stratagem in order to show that the town is doing its best to meet this very, very serious problem and hopefully get support from the state and from all other available sources. We think that there's a logical connection between the occupancy tax and affordable housing. In fact, it's my understanding that the legislative history of it would indicate that when the legislation was passed to cover short-term rentals, that initially there was some proposal that there be some direct correlation between the funds raised from that and that they be used for, in part, at least for affordable housing. That didn't wind up in the final legislation, but I think it's something that's been under consideration and thought about. And again, there's a logical connection to all of this because the workforce that are involved in supporting the hotels, motels, short-term rentals, the sources of these funds are all in the range where they are in need. The employees, the workforce are in need of housing that they can, of decent housing that they can afford, which has certainly been a problem and an issue over the years. So there's been the suggestion that perhaps this might be the least efficient way of doing it because of the fact that the mechanics of stabilization fund involve a new appropriation being made to get the funds, the money out of the fund and into another fund in connection with affordable housing initiatives that the town would get involved with pursuing. And the way that I would see this as running would be that the article would pass, that the stabilization fund would be created, that when the funds would be, the total amount of funds would be calculated based upon the amount of the revenue received by the town from the occupancy tax in that year, that those funds would be set aside, and that at the next town meeting, there would be a vote taken to appropriate those funds in totality or in near totality to a specific fund that can be used more directly for the purchase of properties or for other purposes as it goes along, probably the Affordable Housing Trust, so that those funds would be in that position and able to be used as needed as opportunities come up for their use, effectively creating what would be a revolving fund. Every year, the funds get set aside, and then at the next town meeting, they are placed in the hands of the Affordable Housing Trust or whatever other entity might be deemed to be appropriate in order to have them be available for use as needed. And under the legislation involving stabilization funds of this type, it would remain in effect for at least 3 years. Presumably it would remain in effect indefinitely. And it's required to remain in effect for 3 years once it's passed. This is a source of funds that until the occupancy tax amendment took place a few years ago, so that short-term rentals, which the amount of revenue from which is much more than that from hotels and motels, because of the fact that most of the occupancy tax is in fact derived from short-term rentals. There are more short-term rentals in Nantucket than there are hotels and motels, motel rooms, that is. The result is that these funds were not historically available to the town, and only in recent years has this come. So I don't think we should consider ourselves as having become too dependent upon these funds for other sources. And in any event, I can't think of any more important, appropriate, and significant need for these funds than for the provision of affordable housing. My understanding is that the last year's revenues from the occupancy tax were approximately 12.5 to 13 million, somewhere in that range. And so we're talking about something in the general range of 8.5 million as being the amount of funds, the 2/3 that we're talking about, that would thus be made available for affordable housing. So I hope that you will favorably recommend this article this time. I think it's an important thing for the town to do. I think it was made clear in a meeting that the select board had with Senator Seer that the more actions the town takes to show the significance of their effort and the depth of their effort in dealing with the provision of funds for affordable housing, the greater the chance, the greater the likelihood that legislative action will be taken in the future to augment that and to support the town's housing efforts. Again, we need to use every tool that we have in order to bring this forward and to keep the momentum that we have and need to have in connection with the provision of affordable housing. Obviously happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Arthur. So is Brian on, Maria?
Yes.
Okay. First, I'll go to the committee and check to see that there's questions. Peter?
Yeah, hi, Arthur. From the time the money is raised to the time it will be able to be spent, what's the time period in there? Is it a year?
Well, I would say that the funds would be available at the time. Well, first of all, the funds would come out from the revenues from the occupancy tax at the end of the year and would be placed into the stabilization fund so that at the next town meeting, the vote would be able to take place for those funds to be put in the appropriate place to be able to be used.
I think Brian would have the answer to that, and I'm
Yeah.
guessing it's 6 to 9 months. Brian?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So the mechanics would be if this were to pass at the annual town meeting, we would start depositing money into the special purpose stabilization fund, beginning with the first payment in September of 24, but that would not be able to be allocated until 2025. This at the annual town meeting. So there would be well over a year that Affordable Housing Trust would only be able to most likely only be able to utilize the money that they have that has currently been allocated. This money would not be able to be touched for any at all until town meeting appropriated it. One observation I first want to make, and then I'll turn it back to the board for questions, Madam Chair, is that it would not operate like a revolving fund. Okay, the money would go in, and every town meeting it would have to be appropriated for purposes, and it would take a 2/3 majority to get that money out. It does not operate like a revolving fund where it can be spent without further appropriation okay, it would go into the fund, and every town meeting there would have to be a proposal put forth to withdraw the money. And if town meeting didn't agree with that proposal, or 2/3 of the voters at town meeting did not agree with the proposal put forth to spend the money, it would sit there until it was able to come out.
This question, Brian, question?
Yeah, go ahead, Chris. Thank you, Brian.
Does the mechanism that Mr. Reed talked about work though, where it can be, where that appropriation can be into a fund that essentially is unrestricted?
You'd have to identify what the appropriation is for. is the way that I understand it. So when you're appropriating the money for a particular purpose.
Right, but I think the mechanism, and Mr. Reed, you can correct me if I'm wrong, was that it would be, the ask at town meeting would be it appropriated into a fund that would have a great deal of flexibility. As opposed to a specific project. Is that not what Mr. Reed said?
That's what Mr. Reed said, but what Brian
That's-
is saying
Is
is
that's not
that,
possible?
that's not possible.
It has to be appropriated at town meeting for a purpose. Now, I guess
guess
how
what
you
the
want to
definition
structure
for
that purpose, but at the end of the day, regardless of how you structure the purpose, it still requires a 2/3 majority to get the money out.
No, I understand that point, but my question is, can the purpose be to go into a fund that has general uses? Recognize you would need the 2/3 vote.
Or can it just go into the budget of the Affordable Housing Trust?
Well, that's sort of what, yeah, one way. Can it be?
If it's voted on to do that, yeah.
As opposed to, I think what we're trying to solve for here, right, is that, to have the flexibility of having a bunch of money when opportunities come and not having to
Right.
go, right? And the question is,
So-
does this, or doesn't it solve it?
So would this be an appropriate time for me to make further comments, Madam Chair, or do you want me to wait?
Go ahead, Brian. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so, I mean, first of all, the same issues still arise as we talked about the last time, that there's a high hurdle to get it out, and there's a very significant risk that the funds may, I don't know if they will or won't come out. Number two, we're talking about a problem that by everybody's account has been a problem on the island for more than 20 years, okay? And you're trying to solve that problem with well, we can certainly have disagreements on this. What I would classify as an unstable source of revenue, because there's no predictability in the fact, I can't guarantee you every year you will get $13 million or $12.5 million. And the Affordable Housing Trust has typically requested, and we've authorized borrowing authorizations, which most likely this money in the stabilization fund would most likely be used to cover some or all, would eventually be used to cover that debt service. If the fund doesn't have enough money to cover that debt service in a particular year because there's not enough money being generated and transferred into the stabilization fund, then that immediately would fall back to the general fund to make up any of that differences to solve that issue in that gap. Okay. Secondly, the fact remains still that the town has made a substantial commitment. Since 2018, the town has allocated and appropriated at annual or special town meetings $62.1 million to affordable housing. Of that, $56,500,000 is borrowing authorizations. $4 million of that is through raise and appropriate and CPC allocations. And that's not including almost $2 million worth of appropriations in the general fund budget for staffing and other items within the general fund budget. So all told, we have made a concerted commitment of almost $65 million since 2018. The fact is that the way the legislation was written, the only reference to affordable housing is in a community impact fee, which must be allocated 35% at minimum if we were to adopt it to sewer, water, or affordable housing. I don't agree with the observation that since the room occupancy was expanded, that we haven't come to rely on that money, because all of the services that the very same visitors that we want to move some of the tax that is being paid into another fund have come to expect the good services at the levels that we provide. That money has been in the budget since the day that this was expanded and continues to be funded into the budget. This year alone, in 22 for 23's budget, we allocated about 1.6 million specifically to affordable housing through raise and appropriate, not including the general fund salaries and everything. Now, I know that it may be really elegant to make visitors pay for a portion of affordable housing, okay? But this is really a tax-based problem because it's existed for a very long time, and the tax base is where I think town administration believes that this should exist. Just so that everybody is aware, if this article were to pass, even at a minimum of 25% up to 67% to 2/3, it would take anywhere between $4 and $8.5 million out of the budget. which would not be elegant to try to cut $8 million in operating expenses, which would most likely be personnel. Because there's no other place to go in a budget that is generally between 75 and 80% personnel driven. Now, town administration certainly recognizes that there's an affordable housing issue, and I believe we've been making a substantial commitment on a year-over-year basis to affordable housing. We have a proposal or discussion with the Affordable Housing Trust next week for a $5 million override, which would increase annually, just like all the other overrides that we've done, at 2.5%, which would allow them to authorize borrowings and would create a stable source of revenue that would be predictable on an annual basis as to what they're going to get. This is a very unpredictable way to fund what I think everybody agrees is one of the most, if not, the most pressing issue that we're facing right now. And to do it with this revenue source, I think would be irresponsible on the part of everyone involved.
Thank you, Brian. Further questions for Brian and Arthur? Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, can I continue? I guess, and this is probably for Mr. Reed, I'm struggling with a little bit as to why it's important to do it in this way. I mean, we all get the affordable housing, need for affordable housing, but we seem to have no issue, as Brian pointed out, in going to the voters and getting money for affordable housing with flexibility. So why is the reason to restrict it in this way, basically create this restriction for that show of good faith relative to legislation? Or is there another thing that I'm missing that is the reason to do this?
Well, I think, if I may, first of all, I think good faith and promotion of the town's activities in this regard, as far as its perception by the state, is important. I think that there are some other factors involved in this. First of all, these funds, once they're set aside, cannot be used for any other purpose. They can only be used for this. And accordingly, although it would require a 2/3 vote of town meeting in order to appropriate them every year into the fund that would be that they would be ultimately expended from, once that 2/3 vote has taken place, there's no further action that's required by the voters, either at town meeting or at the ballot box. And granted that those funds can't be used for any other purpose, I would see that the 2/3 vote to appropriate them in that fashion at town meeting would be routine, and I cannot imagine that there would be any discussion, because once again, they're already dedicated for that purpose. The overrides obviously always require a ballot vote, and we all know that overrides that town meeting often will vote money for various purposes, and that the voters are much more conservative at the ballot box, it seems, and that overrides of things that were handily passed at town meeting sometimes fail. So I think that that this is a much more surefire way of getting the funds out to the intended purpose. And as to this being a fund that would be unpredictable in terms of the amount of revenue that would be derived from it, I think that that's a bit of a misleading statement, because I think that there's no question that the trend is up. The trend in rents and hotel rooms and so on is up, and there is no indication that Nantucket is at any time going to become a less desirable vacation resort for those who would be paying this tax. So I think that, although, yeah, we don't know from year to year exactly what the amount of money is going to be, but I can't conceive of it being anything other than an upward trend.
Thank you, Arthur. Peter, did you have any further questions?
No, one of the things that's bothering me right now is number one is, I guess the question is, the amount of money that will be pulled out for affordable housing, how are we gonna make that up, number one? And number two is, I'm getting to the point now where I think land is our biggest problem. And without land, it's not gonna matter if we have money to build houses or buy houses. So, you know, and I don't see how we're directing anything towards somehow being able to acquire land for affordable housing.
Okay, Joe,
Different subject, but same issue.
thank you. Joe, go ahead.
Quick question, either for Arthur or for Brian, I'm not sure. How do you turn this off? Let's say this was passed at town meeting and 2/3 of the occupancy tax is devoted to affordable house, to the stabilization fund. How do you stop it? Does that require another town meeting vote? does it go on forever? What?
Brian, I'll let you, you're the expert on stabilization, so I'll let you answer that, please.
Well, as Arthur mentioned, if it were to be approved at town meeting, it would be in effect for 3 years. And then after that, town meeting would be the deciding factor whether to continue or if an article was brought forth to terminate it. So it's
Right.
town meeting would be the ones that would adopt it or to remove it. And I just want to make one comment, Madam Chair,
Please.
about the room occupancy tax. While we all might think that it's going to continue in an upward trajectory, just to let you know, the second quarter actually was 11.5% below the year-over-year quarter. So last year's quarter and second quarter of fiscal 22, we brought in a little almost 5.9 million in rooms tax across the entire spectrum. And in this year, in 23, we brought in just under 5.3 million. So we did take in about just under 11% less this same quarter on a quarter-over-quarter basis from the prior year. So it does fluctuate. It is not going to always stay on an upward trend. And that's proven by this quarter in this economic environment we're in right now.
Thank you, Brian. I just want to, Stephen and Joanna, I know I can't see you, but I haven't forgotten that you'll want to ask questions. Go ahead, Joe.
A question for Arthur, the language in the article talks about affordable housing. Are you do you believe this definition, restricts these funds to only be focused on affordable development, i.e. 80% AMI or lower, or do you believe it would allow these funds to be used for workforce housing, development of housing for people that aren't affordable, but maybe, income constrained or certainly challenged to buy real estate at the open market here on Nantucket?
The language in the article refers to affordable and year-round. So the point being that it is not limited to affordable within the 80% meaning of affordable housing. It can cover all types of year-round housing. I didn't put any specific percentage in there, but I know that the concept of sustainable year-round housing, as it's been addressed by the Affordable Housing Trust, has gone above that to the, I think, 150%, 200% in some cases.
Right, and I think those are some of the properties, I think, Arthur, that are, or the types of properties that the island's going to need. We're actually approaching the point where, we're going to be at 10% of the affordable level housing probably in the next 3 or 4 years, I think. So I was curious whether other types of local or workforce housing would be included. So thank you.
Before I go to Penny, I know you want to speak, but I want to make sure the finance committee gets their questions in first, and then I'll come to you. So Stephen, you're up next. I'm sure you have questions.
No, I'll pass it over to Joanna. I saw your hand up.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Joanna?
I think the thing that I'm mostly concerned about is that, and Arthur, I really respect that you brought this forward, and it on the surface feels like it should be a very good idea. And then I'm concerned about what Brian is talking about on the backside, right? The fact that could potentially take away money from the budget, that we have little actual control over how we can mandate it's replaced, right? Like it concerns me greatly that we would have to cut from somewhere else, right? And so I agree that the tax or the tax on the hospitality is not predictable, but I'm more concerned that we could be putting ourselves in a situation where we have to replace $6 to $8 million in the operating budget with no mechanism to do it. Right. And so I think that that's really my concern around this, because certainly I think everyone wants to support the issue of affordable housing.
Thank you, Joanna. Any other questions from the Finance Committee?
Nope.
Penny?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Two quick comments. One, to Joe Grouse's question about the definition of affordable. I sit on the Affordable Housing Trust. We actually have an article in this year's warrant to expand the definition up to 240% of area median income. And that level between 150 and 240, we're calling attainable housing. That's one thing. Secondarily, this has been an issue for a lot longer than 20 years here. It's been an issue the entire 50 years that I've been here. In 1983, when the land bank was founded, the elegance of that was that the community understood the importance of harnessing a market to achieve the community-wide goal, which in their case was the acquisition of open space for everybody to use. It's the popularity of Nantucket that finds us today with an average home price in excess of $4 million. I'm completely in support of Arthur's article because it harnesses, again, the popularity of Nantucket, the vacation rentals as part of the room occupancy tax to address this single most challenging issue. And that is what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Penny, this is Denise. Do your article to change the definition of affordable housing to 240% and attainable housing, is it a zoning article? Because it's not in front of FinCom.
No, it's to expand it. It has to do with how the trust was organized. And I can see Brian, as chair of the trust, has his hand up, and he can probably explain this in greater detail than I, but it gives us more flexibility going forward. And it doesn't expand affordable to 240, but attainable is the next level above affordable with the goal towards ownership.
Thanks. No, my question was more that we didn't see the article, and then I just realized it's probably a select board article, and
Exactly
Chris-
right. Yep.
Chris confirmed that for me. So thank you. Okay, Brian?
Thank you.
Thanks, Penny. Brian?
Thanks, Denise. I find myself here wearing a couple of different hats. I'll start the statement that I'm incredibly, as the current chairperson of the Affordable Housing Trust, I'm extremely appreciative of all the support the community and administration has given us, and this committee has given us through funding of the $65 million that Brian outlined has happened in the past. I will note that yesterday Nantucket received its certification from DHCD for another 2 years of safe harbor. I believe that notice was shared with some members of the committee. So pretty exciting achievement for our community that we're, as was said, we're quickly making our way to the 10%. As I've been working on this issue, more recently, I clearly recognize that affordable and attainable housing on Nantucket is very easily a $400 million problem. If we have 5,000 year-round homes on the island, to get us to a place of 10% affordable and an additional 10% we'll call attainable, it is an incredible, on an equity basis of, let's call it 20% equity, it's going to cost us another $400 million to get to a place where we're securing housing opportunities for people. When the short-term rental tax was passed at the state, it was 2018, and the select board was in consideration of where to set their rate. Was it 2%, 3%, 5%, 6%? At that meeting, I stood up and spoke against my peers in the real estate community and very clearly stated that there would be no harm to the tourist industry here to set the limit at 6%, and that a portion of that 6% at that time should be directed to affordable housing to work on the issue. I do recognize Brian's statements that it is a fluctuating basis. You know, I do question, you know, from my professional hat, I would say that more of the inventory was booked this year in the third quarter of last year for this coming year, because people were anxious not to miss out on inventory. So last year's third quarter number will be interesting to see, fourth quarter number will be interesting to see how it merits up against this year. You know, his point that some of this money is used for salaries and we shouldn't be using it for affordable housing because it's a questionable, unpredictable funding source. I would say just the same in reverse about salaries. We should be putting an override into the budget to protect our employees of our town. And so we should guarantee those salaries and incomes moving forward. To Arthur's point, ballot votes are hard to get for things like affordable housing. The base of employees will get out to vote and support, you know, a salary increase on an override at the ballot. I support this. I support anything with affordable housing because we need a fire hose. And I very much appreciate that, you know, Brian will be coming with an article next week for a $5 million override that'll go to the ballot. And I think that that's fantastic and I'm excited about it and I'm going to support that. And I'm going to support Arthur's because, you know, as you focus your attention on finance, I focus my attention on affordable housing. And if we don't get all hands on deck on this problem in the immediate future, we have a 10-year window that is closing faster than we could imagine. And I don't think anybody expected in 1985 for the land bank to be as successful as it was when a difficult decision was made to tax the popularity of Nantucket as Penny did to become as successful as they has become. And so now the Affordable Housing Trust and our community needs housing as infrastructure. Housing is infrastructure for Nantucket. It is as critical as sewer and roads and everything else in it, because if we don't have it, we're going to lose our economy. So thank you for having me today and to share my thoughts.
Thank you, Brian. Brian, where do you come up with the 5,000 year-round houses? How do you know that?
So the 10% that we need for Shy is 490. That number is 10% of the year-round housing occupancy. So that came out of the, I guess, the 2010 census
Okay.
number. Do I believe that number is higher? I absolutely believe that number is higher, but that's the census data we have to work with.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Just the 10-year window closing, I didn't understand the
Yeah,
reference.
could you, Brian Sullivan, Chris has a question for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, from my perspective, as I look at the community members that are here, there is a significant base of year-round individuals that have been on Nantucket for 30-ish years, right? They're business owners, they're longtime property owners, they're within the community. They're nearing the opportunity of retirement. I see them selling their properties, taking the equity from those properties and moving on to the next phase and segment of their life. Those properties are falling into vacation category type properties. And we are losing that inventory to second homeowners, to the popularity of Nantucket. We're also losing that inventory to the land bank, and we're losing that inventory in a variety of places. So I think there is a aging out of baby boomer population on Nantucket that we're seeing leaving that will only increase over the course of the next 10 years, that will create more of a shift to seasonal residents than year-round residents. That's just my personal opinion, anecdotally based on my experience in my professional career.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Couple comments from my side. One of the things that I like about the $5 million override is it gives you a lot more immediacy to being able to spend, because once the money sits in the stabilization fund, technically it could be 6 to 9 months before it can be taken out. And what's happened always is anything that has to go to town meeting then ends up with a delay and the opportunity can be lost, especially here where things change quite quickly from a real estate perspective. So I like the fact that the $5 million override would give us actually more flexibility and immediacy to solving the problem. The second piece of it is I make it personal in a sense that if I have income for 2 or 3 different sources and I buy something new, and lunch, who cares? I don't care what the source was. I didn't need to have my lunch money come from being a farmer. I just have the money available. So whilst I understand it's attractive to take it from the occupancy tax, if the town is coming up with the money, I'm not, irrespective, I just want the money. I don't really, from my perspective, I'm not that fussed about where it came from. So if there's a $5 million override, and Brian Turbot, please correct me, but I think don't overrides have to be spent on what they're overriding? So for example, our island home, $5 million, that money has to be for our island home every year. It's not then usable to go buy a new dump truck, or I could be incorrect on that.
So in the first year of the override, it has to be used for the stated purpose of that is in the appropriation and in the override vote. After that, it becomes part of the levy limit, and this will be presented to the Affordable Housing Trust as well on Tuesday. However, every override that we've done when we're building the budget is automatically allocated the funding prior to any discussions with town administration about what the available funding from all, real and personal property taxes and other general revenues. So for an example, when we built the budget and started with the revenue funding for this year, there wasn't a $5 million override granted to our island home. So when we began building the budget for 24, immediately before we presented any revenue numbers for general fund spending to town administration, the override for Ireland home, the override for mosquito control, which was another one that was voted, and one of the overrides for solid waste are all removed from the calculation so that money is in theory dedicated to those funds specifically, so that it can't be spent for any other purpose. So those are automatically removed by my department and my staff before we make those presentations and discussions with town administration.
And that's great because, that you understand that was the will of the voters and that was the intention.
Yes,
And so
absolutely.
to kind of married to Arthur's point about the stabilization fund, which is, there's then no chance of using it for anything else. Is there a way going forward, if this was to be an override instead of a stabilization fund, is there any way to assure that everyone is like Brian in the future? In case, 30 years from now, you're not the director of finance.
I can't promise you that 30 years from now, A, that I'll still be here, and B, that the next person, if I'm not here, or the same commitment, but I can assure you that that's town administration's commitment, and I don't, given the size and scope of the problem, I don't see that changing, quite frankly. And it's been consistent since I've been here. When we had the override for solid waste, it's always been pulled out first because that was committed and that was represented to the voters. And, we certainly take those responsibilities and those promises very seriously.
Yeah, no, I understand. And I personally wouldn't be concerned one bit. And I think I was just trying to reflect back to Arthur's point around the stabilization fund, and then therefore the money is just for that always. And to Penny's point, and to just trying to, bridge the two.
I don't know, I think, I'm sorry. Priorities change. I think coastal resiliency would make affordable housing look like a small problem.
Yeah.
Joe, go ahead.
Brian, with the $5 million, the proposed $5 million override for affordable housing, how are you going to fund that?
How would we fund the override? It would be an addition to the levy limit through the tax base.
So basically, okay, so the levy limit
We would ask,
expands by $5
we would ask,
million.
yes.
You adjust tax rates so that we generate an extra $5 million in tax revenue.
Yes, we would ask for a permanent override, so it would be in the levy limit every single year on a go-forward basis. And as we've done previously, it would be increased by 2.5% annually.
Thank you.
And can I
Go
keep
ahead.
going?
Yes.
And as you say, it becomes permanent and disconnected from the purpose that it was stated for in year one. And there is no sunset. So the $5 million plus 2.5% just like all the other overrides we've talked about, goes on into the future.
Unless somebody were to propose an underride to remove it, that's correct.
An underride.
Wow. We've never had any of those.
I've never seen one in my lifetime, so.
Penny, you have further comments?
Yes, I do. I'd like to respectfully point out that the source of the funding does matter. What Arthur's article does is it puts the funding on our guests and visitors, and the alternative puts it on the voters, and I think it does matter. Thank you.
Yeah, we differ on that opinion. So,
Yeah, I would say the raising the levy limit puts it on summer visitors because they pay 80% of the taxes anyway. So I would disagree with Penny as well.
Well, I think she's drawn the distinction of visitors versus homeowners.
Yeah. Great.
Right.
And good point. Yeah.
okay, committee members, where are we on this? Appetite for a motion? Or wanting to wait until we have more of our committee members attending? I'm open either way. Chris, could you vote today if there was a motion?
Yeah, no, I don't think we're gonna learn anything more, sure.
Okay, Peter,
Yes.
Joe,
I have mixed feelings.
okay, Stephen? If there was a motion today, are you ready to take a vote?
Yes, I would vote, but I do have some questions that I'd like to submit to Libby and to Brian. It's nothing they'll be prepared to produce right now. But I'd like to know specifically what funds are being allocated to support tourists and short-term visitors to the island already. There was a reason that the Massachusetts legislature decided to expand occupancy tax to include short-term rentals. And I believe that reason was that communities such as ours that deal with large seasonal influxes of visitors, their budgets are strained by having to support those populations. So I'd like to see, what holes have been plugged revenue source over the last few years that we may be ignoring by looking at this as all, new or found money.
Okay. All right, Joanna?
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about voting today too.
Okay, well, with that, I will postpone making a motion. We'll get that in, so, Stephen, if you could send to me your questions, and then I'll forward them to Libby and Brian to get answered. And then we'll, Arthur will let you know at which meeting we expect to make a motion, but it won't be probably for a couple of weeks. Joe?
Can I ask one more question
Go right ahead.
of Arthur Reed and Brian?
Brian Turbot.
Brian Turbot,
Okay,
sorry. Maybe an odd thought, but is there any chance of a compromise here? I mean, Arthur, your proposal would basically take $8-9 million from the housing tax,
the general fund.
thank you. What I'm proposing is, Brian, what if you made your override $8.5 million? Do you think there's a way to sort of join forces here and generate the same amount of money, but in a way that the town feels is more flexible and, presents a, I don't know, just sort of a better mechanism than you clearly feel Mr. Reed's article has? And I don't know whether I put that to both of you because I don't know whether maybe you think they both should go before the town meeting, but.
I mean, the whole purpose from our perspective with the override discussion is that we strongly believe that a stable source, obviously being the tax base. And I mean, we should all keep in mind too, that the tax base with 80% being non-residents, the visitors who are utilizing short-term rentals are ultimately paying or contributing to affordable housing through an override because people price their rents to recoup their costs, correct? So they ultimately are paying a portion of the taxes and only paying a portion of the override. I'm not sure how we would merge the two, because I think they're completely independent ways to look at it or to get at the problem. I don't think I'm prepared to make a recommendation in terms of an override for general fund operations. I think that's something that the town manager and I would have to discuss, but I can, as I stated, it would be that if this were to pass, it would be catastrophic. It most likely would require an override if we wanted to keep the same level of services. And it's kind of unique and interesting that we're concerned about overrides for affordable housing, which have historically always passed without much problem here. Since beginning all the way back to 2019, we did one for 20 million. We just did one for 10 million, and we did one for 7.5 million, and they all passed by better than probably 2-to-1 margins. So I don't think that the voters have an issue with being willing to have debt exclusions currently to exceed the levy limit for affordable housing. Historically, overrides for operating have always been inherently more challenging, and that's just a common fact across the Commonwealth. So I don't know what we would do or how we would, if you're talking about lowering the percentage and us asking for an override that closed the gap, Joe, I'm not sure.
No,
I wouldn't
was
want to
just-
speak for
I
Libby on
was
that
just-
one.
I was just thinking, we have two articles here. Well, we have an article and new news tonight that the administration is going to propose an override, and I'm just wondering whether, because it appears to me that the override presents some certainly some administrative and mechanical advantages to the stabilization fund. Would Arthur, be, I don't know what the right way, I'm not sure what, if you made it an $8.5 million override, which is gonna grow into over time, blah, blah, blah. Would that satisfy the need that Arthur has proposed his article for? And maybe we don't have to go to the town meeting with two sort of competing ideas.
Are we just pushing the sand from one pile to the next?
Well, I think we're asking the taxpayers to come up with $8.5 million. It's just Arthur, I think, and I'm putting words in your mouth, Arthur, sees this revenue stream, which is relatively new, and has said, let's carve this off and devote it to a very important priority, which I share. And I would love to get $8.5 million for affordable housing on the island. Probably I'd like to get more, but I don't know. It just crossed my mind that, is there any way to sort of merge these ideas and go with the override idea rather than the stabilization fund?
I mean, to that point, Joe, I guess Arthur, I don't mean to cut you off. I'm very sorry. We are going to talk to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund on Tuesday about this, and if they would, I mean, part of this is, town administration started the discussion. If they believe that the number has to be higher, then I guess that's a conversation that we could have. If that were a way to marry the two causes together and not create as much uncertainty in the operational budget and guarantee affordable housing. I can't speak to the select board's willingness to go to that level or the town managers, but I think that from my perspective, it's a conversation that can be continued. I don't think it's something we would close the door on.
Just before,
From
go ahead, Arthur.
if I may, from my standpoint, obviously I am completely amenable to any discussion that results in the greatest possible attention and funding being given, within reason, obviously, to affordable housing. I don't think that we can work out a solution on that right now, but I'm obviously open to any discussion that would help to resolve the issues.
Thank you, Arthur. I lost my train of thought. So Brian, let's for a moment. Let's say Arthur's article passes. And now the town has a shortfall of 8 million. So does that mean the budget article at town meeting doesn't pass? Because now
No.
we have to have a balanced budget.
No, because correct me if I'm wrong, Arthur, but the way that I read your article is it would start with fiscal 25, which would be July
Okay.
1st of 2024.
Right.
Okay.
However, I would suggest to you that in building the 2025 budget, it would be extremely difficult because we would have zero idea how much would be going into stabilization. I mean, we could look at history and use that as somewhat of a barometer, but we would be taking a leap on what that number would ultimately look like. And if the number came in substantially higher than we had predicted, then we would have we'd have a budget gap that we would have to figure out how to close. So, you know, I'm certainly open to talking, when we talk to the Affordable Housing Trust, getting a better understanding of what they think a potential override number would need to be, and then going and talking to town administration about how do we get there, if that works.
Can I?
Go ahead, Chris.
You lost me in the last part there, Brian, about projecting the budget, because currently you project what you're gonna get from the rooms tax as part, and you take a conservative look at that and building the budget. And so in this model, a percentage of that would go into the stabilization fund. If more money went into the stabilization fund, it would be because you had more money overall. So I don't.
But we would be, right, but we would be losing a higher percent, at 66%, we would be losing a percentage, and we would still have a
Right.
budget gap, because
No, because if you're planning on a third of a number and the whole number is bigger, the third of that bigger number is more money.
but it may not get to where we need to be. I don't know. I mean,
Because
that's
the
my
percentage
case.
doesn't change. Okay.
Well, it's
Fair
two,
enough.
it would be 2/3, but I mean, we are building that beginning in 24 to town meeting, and the receipts will not be received until
If you missed
25,
your
20.
projections, so if the number
Yeah.
was smaller, it'd be a problem for you. If the number is bigger, it wouldn't be a problem for you. Fair enough.
Actually, it's the unknown that's the issue.
But we already have the unknown though, right? And
Yes.
so for it to come in, and we don't have to belabor this, but for it to come in higher, it would mean your piece would be higher too. If it comes in lower, your piece would be smaller. So that would be a problem. It would exacerbate a miss to the downside.
So if we think about Brian and the budgeting discussions we've had before, he's always been very conservative.
Got it.
And so therefore, if he's very conservative, you're right, if it's higher, then he's getting a higher percentage. And at the same time, if it comes in significantly lower, yeah, and it could. come
We're
in
also building a
significantly
budget with that
lower.
uncertainty, and if we make a decision and it comes in substantially higher, then we've made budgetary decisions and potentially cut positions and everything that may not have needed to be. So this creates a lot of uncertainty on how to budget and going forward.
It's, well, it's right now, it's 10% of the budget, or not, that's 10%, it's about 8% of our budget, so that's a significant fluctuation in budgeting,
Yes.
right? So,
It
okay,
would be, yes.
Madam Chair,
yes,
Libby has her hand raised.
okay, Libby?
Thank you so much. I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on what Brian Turbot was saying. He and I have to look at the big picture here, and we are obviously all very focused on housing in many areas of our work, but people really need to understand the range of other issues that are pending out there and looming out there, including collective bargaining negotiations, which are ongoing right now. Arguably, the salaries across the board for town employees are not high enough to attract and retain employees on an ongoing basis. We have got to address that, and that is going to cost money. The solid waste issue is massive. I don't think Brian Turbot even touched on it as much as we have talked about it internally. There are huge costs coming towards us there. Capital borrowings and debt service, we borrow for a lot of capital projects, the debt service for which comes out of the general fund. And we are going to continue doing that, and we need a stable revenue source to do that. Stormwater is something coming down the road at us pretty quickly. There are going to be federal requirements and regulations that are not hitting Nantucket yet, but most likely will. And we have huge costs in stormwater that are associated with coastal resiliency issues. Coastal resiliency, I'm glad somebody mentioned that. There's a $900 million coastal resiliency plan. It's not tomorrow, but it's in the next 50 years, lots of projects between now and then, and they are very expensive. A huge project that maybe people heard about at the select board meeting last night is Baxter Road Alternative Access. The abutters are not going to pay entirely for that project. That is just not realistic. That is a $30 to $50 million project. It is not even in the coastal resiliency plan. Town employee housing. these funds hopefully would go towards that or other funds that we are in the drawing board that have already been appropriated and that are pending. Coastal resiliency, I mentioned, sustainability is also it's a little bit of a buzzword, but it's also something that all municipalities are looking at and is going to cost money going forward. The override that I understand and appreciate the concern about operating overrides are used for the intended purpose for the first year, and then they're sort of a free-for-all after that. However, that has not been the case here. The solid waste operating overrides that have been in place for decades have always only been used for solid waste. We have a mosquito control, teeny tiny override for $250,000 is what it started out at, or thereabouts. It's always been used for mosquito control. All of the operating overrides have been used for their intended purpose from day one. So I don't think that it's a valid concern. I don't think it's a serious concern. It's valid, but I don't think it's serious. So I just wanted to really emphasize that Brian and I are all about the big picture, and we've got to keep our eye on that because there's a lot of costs out there.
Thank you, Libby. Okay,
Madam Chair?
yes,
I apologize. Brian Sullivan has his hand raised as well.
okay. Brian Sullivan?
Thank you, Denise. Brian and Libby, I'm looking forward to Tuesday for you coming. Thank you, Libby, for elaborating on that. I totally recognize the massive breadth of things you're working on. I'm staying in my lane on affordable housing, looking for all and any opportunities possible. Brian, I'm not asking you to answer this question now, but when we meet on Tuesday and we have the conversation about varying potential funding levels, my two questions are using that money for bonding and what could 4 million, 5 million, 8 million, 10 million turn into to become operational. And in this $5 million override, is administration looking at this for the Affordable Housing Trust for programs or operational and programs? Are we using this for staffing? And so is this our cumulative budget on an annual basis, or is this just a portion of override to be used for programming and purchase opportunities? So those are my questions when we meet.
I have already calculated the borrowing at a $5 million level, which we will present to you, and I can do it at a higher level as well.
Great.
With the assumption that we would have left some available for items that would not necessarily be available from a borrowing authorization. So I will have that information at higher levels than the $5 million as well.
Great. Thank you, Brian.
And we'll have the answer to your other question at the meeting as well.
Denise, thank you to your committee through you, and I appreciate everybody's time today.
Thanks, Brian. Okay. Then,
Seems like we couldn't really vote it anyway until we see the other one, right?
Yeah.
Until we see what they're gonna bring in terms of an override.
yep, okay,
So,
yep, makes sense. Okay, so thank you, Arthur. You can go to planning board now. I think we're probably anxiously awaiting your
Yep.
arrival. So thanks, and I will let you know.
Thank you very much
Arthur.
indeed.
I will email you when we're
Yep.
at the point of making a motion.
I appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Okay, take care. Thank you. All
Bye.
right. Is there anyone on Maria that wants to discuss any of the other citizen warrant articles?
No hand raised.
No hands raised. Okay, moving on. Next meeting is Tuesday, January 17th at 4 p.m. It is a fully virtual meeting. We will be discussing the noise article and the HTC administrator. Those are the two articles up for discussion. Is there any other business from anyone on the committee? No,
are we gonna do assignments again for the, what is it, the 20, is it, we're 2 Saturdays away from.
28, yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, we can do. We can do that at the next meeting.
Okay.
Okay, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, and then I have one article of other business, which there'll be no meeting on the 19th because Brian and Libby are not able to make it, and I don't like them to miss any of our FinCom meetings. So, yes. Okay,
All right, so we're reading that one.
so you can delete the 19th. And then I am looking for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Thank you. And roll call, Chris,
No
Peter.
problem.
Aye.
Peter,
Aye.
Joe,
Aye.
Joanna,
Aye.
Stephen,
Aye.
And Denise, I thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for the great discussion, and we will see you next Tuesday, and it's completely virtual.
Why, can I just ask why, Denise?